These texts of anticipation of Christ coming again, telling us to be alert and ready, can be relatively heavy. But I want you to hear that very last verse in particular. Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing. It is a word of encouragement. With that in mind, we read also a parable from Matthew's Gospel. I encourage you to find that in the Bible you brought from home or in the Pew Bible provided. Matthew chapter 25, beginning with the 14th verse. The parable of the talents. Listen for the word of God. For it is if a man going on a journey summoned his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy servant. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made you 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy servant. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy servant. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless servant, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Here ends our reading of God's holy word. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. This is the word of the Lord. Based on your biblical knowledge and your hopes and your recollection of St. Peter jokes, what do you think heaven looks like? And not only that, when you get there, your very first impression, what do you think is the first thing you hear one of the heavenly hosts say to you? My thought is, and I don't think it's the very first thing, but I think one of the questions heard in heaven is a question that is often used at one of my favorite eateries. Perhaps you have been there. It is not in Chattanooga. It is the biggest and best greasy spoon in the world. It's in Atlanta. It's called the Varsity. It's open 24/7. They have the best onion rings ever. And they have a very unique way of greeting you as you approach the counter. They say over and over and over again, What do you have? What do you have? What do you have? What do you have? I think that question might be a question heard in heaven. No, I don't think it's the very first thing that we hear, because we get in not based on what we have or have done, but based solely on the grace of God made known in Jesus Christ. So the question is not part of the entrance exam. I think instead it is a reflection question after we have settled in. Looking at our lives now, or from the vantage point of heaven, looking back over our lives on the other side of heaven's handrail, it's a legitimate question. What do you have? when you look over your life, what have you done with your living and your giving? Have you made a difference in the way you have lived your life? Yes, our entrance into heaven is 100% Christ doing. In John's Gospel, we are told that by Jesus, that I go and prepare a place for you, so that where I am, there you may be also. But with that gracious invitation, that gift of grace, comes responsibility. It is our responding to grace with gratitude. And that's where this parable, our text for today from Matthew's Gospel, and I believe the question asked at the varsity fit together. What do you have? Our parable is the third in a series of parables all about accountability here at the end of Matthew's Gospel. It comes right before Jesus' arrest and betrayal, and this parable is followed by talk of judgment and how the righteous will be rewarded based on what they have done. Each of these parables is about waiting expectantly, about using our gifts of time and our gifts themselves wisely. These parables are about our stewardship, being good managers of what God has given to us. So the parable of the talents in Matthew's Gospel seems pretty straightforward. It's an encouragement to use what God has given us to the glory of God, to work with our gifts, to build on them and not bury them. It seems that the parable is pretty straightforward in that regard, but to interpret it in that way is to interpret it through a thoroughly modern lens and miss what a talent really is. Yes, we all have God-given talents that we are supposed to use, but in this story, a talent is a very specific amount of money. It's a measurement. A talent, as you probably already know, equals 6,000 denarii, right? And a denarii is 1 day's wages for a day laborer. So, to put numbers to that, at the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, for an 8-hour workday, 1 denarii is $58. 1 talent, which is 6,000 denarii, would be $348,000. And that's at minimum wage. So, what do you have? We have a whole lot. God has been very good to us. I'm challenged by Tom Long's interpretation of this parable. He wrote in his commentary, routinely this parable is taken as an encouragement to discover what gifts and talents we all have and to use them for God. So goes the conventional interpretation. There's, of course, nothing wrong with the idea that we should use our talents to glorify God. But that idea alone is far too tame for this parable. The parable is not a gentle tale about what Christians can do with their individual gifts and talents, as helpful as that may be. No, this parable is a disturbing story about what Christians do or do not do with the gospel itself. Here at the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus is not just offering investment advice. He's talking about our stewardship of the gospel itself, a most valuable gift. So what do we have here at Northside Presbyterian Church? What has been entrusted to us? The gospel of Jesus Christ. The life-giving, life-changing good news of the gospel. Now that's quite a gift. It is a God-given gift that has been freely given to us, and it is also a significant responsibility, a calling for us. Hence the question and a follow-up question. What do you have? And what are you doing with it? What we are doing with the good news here is we are here to share it, to be a light on the hill for Christ at Community. Our purpose here is not to take the gospel and lock it away behind a velvet rope or a security system. It is to carry it out of this building and into the community. We are blessed here on this hill beyond measure with the good news of the gospel. The challenge I have for you is, do you as a family of faith act like you have been entrusted with a great and valuable gift? Do we know how much we have received from the generous hands of the Almighty? One of the challenges I think that the church faces this day is underestimating how good the good news is, of taking it and burying it. Sometimes we act like we have so little, when in truth we have so much. So let me ask the question again. Do we here in this church look and act like a people who have been blessed with the greatest of gifts? Do we? I'll risk you a huge and maybe awkward illustration. It seems to me that we are a fully loaded baked potato with sour cream, chives, cheese, and bacon bits. So why do we sometimes act like a cold leftover tater tot? The problem in this text with the third servant is that he received a great gift and he buried it. That's a problem. He had a whole bunch, even with just that one talent, $350,000. And he did a whole lot of nothing with it. Now you talk about a missed opportunity. How much good could this church family do with that one talent? I heard a fundraising specialist giving some church leaders some good advice. He told us that we could learn a lesson from the nonprofits of the world, particularly about how to say thank you and how to talk about how their giving makes a difference. But then he threw in this one other tidbit, and I love this. He said, suppose someone knocks on the pastor's study and says to the pastor, I have $1 million that I'm looking to give away. What would you do with it? He said, your pastor should be able to answer that question with a very clear and concise proposal that has already been approved by the session, just in case you get $1 million. And we can even water that down a little bit. If we had a third of that, one talent, what would we do with it? Why not plan for good things to happen? You know, I think when the new pastor, Paul, gets here, that would be a great problem for him to have. For someone to walk in and say, welcome to Northside, we're glad to have you here. What would you do with $350,000? I'll call him in a few months to see if that has happened. Now, speaking of Paul, I do need to go on record and say this. When I first met Paul, I liked him. And then when he preached, I liked him even more. And then when he went to presbytery meeting and was approved by the presbytery, I liked him even more then. You're going to have a great time together in ministry with your next pastor. God is doing great things here on this hill through you. And God is going to continue to do great things through you. You've got some dreaming and scheming to do, and I encourage you to do that. Now, I'm biased. And I think one of the church's greatest challenges, not just this church, but any church, is that we don't dream enough. We don't dream enough about what God can and will do through us. Maybe we live into our fears more so than we do our faith. Maybe we not only bury our talents, we bury our dreams, and maybe even bury the gospel itself. That is a problem for the postmodern church, and it's a problem in this ancient parable. But it's a problem rooted in an even bigger problem. As you read the text, you'll notice it's how the third servant sees the master. The master entrusts the servants with a great deal of wealth, but it is the third servant who says that the master is a harsh man. The master calls the first two servants good and trustworthy. Maybe the problem is not so much poor investment strategy on the part of the third servant, it's how the third servant sees the master. Is the God we follow a harsh God? A God of scarcity? Or is the God we follow a generous God, a God from whom all blessings do indeed flow? How do we see God? Again, I'm indebted to Tom Long and his commentary on it, as he notices the difference between the servants and how they view the master. He writes, "The story is not about a generous master suddenly turning cruel and punitive. It's about living with the consequences of one's own faith. If one trusts the goodness of God, one can boldly venture out with eyes wide open to the grace in life and can discover the joy of God's providence everywhere. For those who live in the confidence that God is trustworthy and generous, they find more and more of that generosity. But for those who run and hide under the bed from a bad, mean, and scolding God, they condemn themselves to a life spent under the bed alone, quivering in needless fear." Do we trust in the goodness and the generosity of God? Do we trust in the generosity and goodness of God enough to act on it? Enough to act on it in our living and giving. Now, I've been here long enough to know that you do trust in the goodness and generosity of God. I've seen it for myself in my ministry with you. I've seen it up close. And I tell you this, as I have mentioned before, I'm moving to Iowa after Christmas. And the goodness and generosity of God are so evident in this church family that I bet you when I get to Iowa, I can see it from there. Amen.